Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. A couple of weeks ago on one of these live streams, I got a request in the chat for a discussion of the Theravada scriptures, the Pali scriptures, the structure of them and so on. And I asked in the chat if there was interest in that topic, and a few people chimed in and say yes. So that's what I'm going to do today. Talk a bit about the various layers of spiritual literature in Pali. First of all, it's a big topic, but first of all, let's say a few words about the Pali language. Pali is a derivative of Sanskrit. It's actually a simplified Sanskrit. Pali, for example, has 8 cases, and Sanskrit has 10. And there's a number of things like that. It probably was originally a kind of artificial language, sort of an Esperanto. As the Buddhist teaching spread over northern India, the various different dialects had were passing on the teachings in their own dialect. Most of them, or all of them, were various Prakrits, which means derivatives from Sanskrit. And when the time came to put the teachings down in writing, which was several hundred years after the Buddhist time, and was probably first done in Sri Lanka, then the agreement was to use this kind of common medium of Pali. So, contrary to what some people think, the Pali language is not exactly what the Buddha spoke. Scholars call the language he spoke Magadhi. Was one of the dialects that was common in the central part of northern India. So already the scriptures we have are not exactly the word of the Buddha as spoken. They're formalized into this common language that would be accessible to any educated person in India at the time. For the first several hundred years, the suttas were passed down in oral form. And when people hear that, they think, well, then they must be mixed up because people are going to make mistakes in the transmission. But there was actually a very reliable method for passing down the oral scriptures, and that was chanting by groups. This is originally why the suttas were divided into nikayas. I'll get into the structure of the Sutta Pitaka in a bit, but there are 5 nikayas, and 4 of them are called the principal 4 nikayas. And there were 4 colleges of monks, and nikaya is like a group or a college that would specialize in chanting that text, and they would be a group of anywhere from 20 to 100 monks chanting together, and they would go through the whole corpus of that nikaya over the course of several months. And that way, if anybody makes a mistake, it's self-correcting. If you've got 50 or 100 monks chanting together and someone misses a syllable, then it's obvious to him right away, and it's self-correcting. actually transmission by writing, copying manuscripts is much more unreliable, and it's much easier for mistakes to creep in that way. So we have to explain the various texts, collections. We need to get into a little bit of early Buddhist history. After the Buddha died, after entered Parinibbana, they held what was called the First Council. And there was a gathering of 500 monks, all arahant, who went over all the Buddha's teaching and formalized it, like this is what the Buddha said. And Ananda was critical in that process because if he had a phenomenal memory and he had attended the Buddha for many years and had heard all his discourses. So that formalized the at least the Sutta and the Vinaya at the First Council. Then there was a second council 100 years after the Buddha's death, and that council was essentially a failure because the teachings had spread far and wide across India, and there were different groups living far away from each other, and they were beginning to have divergent practices and doctrines. And the attempt was made to get everybody in agreement again. But it ended up being a split. They couldn't all agree, and there were two factions, the Sthaviravada and the Mahasangika. And in the course of the next century or two, these kept splitting again and again until there were 18 different schools. It's interesting that we have, surviving to the present day, we have two accounts of the Second Council, and they're quite different. They don't agree with each other in too many particulars. And it seems to be the one originated with the Sthaviravada faction and one with the Mahasangika. The Sthaviravada faction, which was the ancestor of the Theravada school, they that account is found in the Vinaya text, and it maintains that the split was entirely about points of Vinaya, that the Mahasangikas wanted to loosen up some of the Vinaya rules, and the Theravada wanted to, or the Sthaviravada, I should say, wanted to maintain a strict adherence to the original rules. The other account, which survives in Tibetan translation, makes it all about differences of doctrine. That basically the Mahasangika school were proto-Mahayanists in a way. They elevated the status of the Buddha to closer to a deity, and they downgraded the status of the Arahants. But in any case, that the importance for our purposes about the scriptures is that this is one way we can, or scholars can make an approximation of how accurate the scriptures are, because there survives, from those early days of Buddhism, there survives only the Theravada corpus complete. But there are scriptures in Chinese translation called the Agamas that belong to various other of the early schools, and they can be compared to the Pali texts. And where there's a divergence, then that must have occurred after the Second Council, because that was when the schools split. But where they agree, we know that passage is at least as old as the Second Council, that is 100 years after the Buddha's time. And it seems that the agreement is pretty good. The scriptures are probably not very much tampered with from those early times. The general agreement is quite solid. There's also another way of comparing texts, the authenticity of texts, in that Pali has no alphabet of its own, and whatever country it's established in, the texts are written down with the alphabet of that country. So there's a Burmese recension, they call it. There's a Siamese recension, that's Thai, and a Sinhalese or Sri Lankan recension. And these three recensions can be compared, and it's found, and they diverged at some early date, but it's found that they're extremely close to each other. There's very little difference. So it seems like the scriptures were maintained with some fidelity from early times. So now to get to the actual structure of them, we could say that in the Pali literature there's three main layers. There's the Pitaka, the Atthakatha, and the Tika. That is the canon, the commentaries, and the subcommentaries. The canon are three baskets or pitakas: Sutta, Vinaya, and Abhidhamma. The Sutta and Vinaya, at least, were rehearsed at the first council. The Suttas are the record of the Buddha's teachings, and it's a very voluminous collection of texts. If you have the whole Sutta Pitaka in book form, it takes up a large bookshelf to contain all these books. And they're divided into 5 Nikayas. The Digha Nikaya, the long discourses, or the collection of long discourses, is generally the first one that's recommended for people to read if you're going to start studying the suttas. And that's because some of the very important principal suttas, like the Satipatthana Sutta and the Mahanaparinibbana Sutta, the Brahmajala Sutta, they're included in that collection. And it seems like that Digha Nikaya collection was put together for new converts or for missionary work, to spread the Buddhist teaching. So it was intended as be the first introduction. The Majjhima Nikaya would be the second one to go to. It's the middle-length discourses. It's a much longer book. The individual suttas tend to be shorter. That's not a hard and fast rule, but they tend to be shorter. But it's a longer book in general, and that is a bit more advanced, and it seems like it was intended for people who had already committed to the Buddhist path and wanted to study more. And then the Samyutta Nikaya is the connected discourses. Is a very large collection that has a lot of very short suttas arranged according to specific topics, like the pit origination, stream winners, various other dewas. There's various chapters based on a topic, and this would be for advanced students or very much committed and to a deeper study. Some of the texts in the Samyutta tend to get very technical, so it approaches Abhidhamma in some ways, in some parts. And the Anguttara Nikaya is the numerical discourses, and that may have been intended as a teacher's manual, as giving all the lists. Probably, if you've looked at Buddhist teachings at all, you're probably very familiar with the pattern of there'll be lists of 6 of this, 7 of that, 8 of the other. And this book is arranged according to numbers. There's a book of ones, a book of twos, all the way up to the book of 11s. And it's entirely these lists, although some of the suttas are a bit longer because there's explanations and expansions on the lists. And finally, those are called, those four, Tika, Majjhima, Samyutta, and Anguttara, are called the principal Nikayas. And there's a fifth one that's kind of the miscellaneous collection, the Khuddaka Nikaya. And that has a lot of various heterogeneous kind of material. Anything that didn't get fit into one of the other four Nikayas ended up in the Khuddaka. And that includes the Sutta Nipata. It's a very important text. It includes the Jataka stories and the Dhammapada and the Petawatu and the Vanamanawatu. And some of the texts in the Khuddaka are considered to be late additions. They weren't originally part of the collection. But the Sutta Nipata certainly is very original, and some of the scholars who study the forms of language say that the Sutta Nipata is probably one of the very first original texts put together, because the Pali forms are kind of archaic. One example is that in the Sutta Nipata, the god Saka is usually referred to as Inda, which is the version of the Vedic name Indra. So that's already an archaism compared to the other texts. So that's the Sutta Pitaka. The Vinaya Pitaka is a collection of the monks' rules and also procedures, and also a lot of historical material, like the account of the Buddha's life and enlightenment and early years of teaching is all found in the Vinaya Pitaka. So it's a lot more than just the bare bone rules. What most people are probably familiar with, if they're familiar with anything here, is the Patimokkha, which is actually not a book in the Vinaya Pitaka, but it's an extract. It's the rules listed and summarized, and it's what the monks chant at, every 2 weeks at the Patimokkha recitation in the monastery. 227 rules for monks. In the actual original text, it reads that the sections that deal with the rules, they read a lot like law books, if you're familiar with law books. Because it is a legal code, basically. There'll be the bare statement of the rule, which is what's chanted at the Patimokkha. Then there'll be a word-by-word analysis of the rule, defining terms, which you see in modern law books as well. Then there'll be case examples of things that may, there'll be first, before that, there'll be origin story. There'll be why the Buddha laid the rule down. Then there'll be case-by-case examples of cases that might be considered gray areas, and the ruling of the Buddha that may have modified the rule over time. And it's considered now that the Vinaya rules are fixed after the Buddha passed into Parinibbana. There's no one with authority to change the rules. So the final form they took by the end of the Buddha's life is inalterable until the next Buddha comes. Then the third Pitaka is the Abhidhamma Pitaka, which is a collection of 7 books that deal with the technical analysis of psychology and mental states, mental contents, and so on. Abhidhamma literature makes very dry reading. Unlike the Sutta or the Vinaya, there are no stories, there are no anecdotes, there's nothing to enliven the text. It's just a bare technical exposition of how the various components of the mind work together. And I would say here that the Abhidhamma collection is probably later than the other two books or the other two baskets, because we do have some Abhidhamma texts from other schools, and they're quite divergent. They're quite different from the Theravada and from each other. So my theory on that, my take on that, is that the Abhidhamma was developed by each separate school as a kind of a manifesto, a declaration of how they understand the material in the suttas, with the attempt to fill in all the gaps and explain all the uncertain points and clarify everything. And it ends up that each school had their own particular collection. One of the books in the Abhidhamma is the Katawatu, which is a very interesting text to look at. It's probably the only one you could read for sort of entertainment. It's only one of the Abhidhamma books. It's a debate manual. It's a collection of debated points between the Theravada and various other of the early schools. And it being a Theravada text, of course, the Theravada always wins the debate, but they go back and forth and argue various points. One of the tropes or repeated motifs in the book is there'd be an argument based on getting the opponent to contradict himself. He'll make some statement, and then you draw him out on the implications of that statement until he ends up proving the opposite of what he started with. And then the other debater will say, "Aha, sir, you are defeated, you are beaten, you are ground to the dust. What you said in the beginning does not agree with what is said in the end." So it's kind of an interesting book for both for the kind of intellectual play back and forth, and also historically to see the positions of the other early schools of Buddhism on some a lot of the debates are on very minute, picky sort of points, but it's a very useful text for scholars trying to reconstruct the early days of Buddhism. So that the Abhidhamma and the Katawatu is admitted even by the very orthodox that it is the last book was added in to the canon, probably at the time of King Asoka. So the canon was considered closed. There was a council held by King Asoka, and the canon was considered closed after that. And there are the next kind of important layer of Pali literature is the Atthakatha, which we call in English the commentary. And this involves the very interesting and brilliant figure of Buddhaghosa. Buddhaghosa was a monk born in northern India. He lived probably about in the 5th century AD, so that would have been 800 years or so after the Buddha. And he had before he became a Buddhist, he was a Vedic scholar. He was a master of the Vedic literature. He had a very brilliant encyclopedic kind of mind. And he's searching, after he became a Buddhist, he was searching everywhere for complete texts of the old commentaries. That is, there was supposedly, we don't have them anymore, but they call old commentaries. there were texts written down in Pali in 100 or 200 years after the Buddha by his successors to clarify teachings and fill in the gaps and explain context. And he couldn't find a complete set of these commentaries anywhere in India, and he ended up going to Sri Lanka. And there he found that they no longer had the original Pali commentaries, but they had a complete set of translations into Sinhalese. And he spent many years back translating the Sinhalese texts into Pali. And so those are those texts that he translated are what we have now as the Etikata, or the commentaries. They were preserved from that time. So we don't know, and it's impossible to know, how much editorial license Buddhaghosa took. I mean, standards of scholarship at the time were not, in anywhere in the world, were not as they are today. With he wouldn't cite sources or have footnotes or anything like that. He may have extrapolated here and there, may have added bits or modified them to bring them into harmony. We don't know how much is Buddhaghosa's own invention and how much is actual translation from the Sinhalese commentaries, which also no longer exist. All we have are Buddhaghosa's work. Now the commentaries are texts that are associated with each sutta. Just about every sutta in the principal Nikayas anyway have a Atikata attached to them, and they will give and they're very useful texts for a translator, because sometimes the original Pali in the sutta may be difficult to decipher, and then the commentary will rephrase the statement in another way and give you another chance, another crack at it. It'll go often line by line, even word by word, with explanations and definitions. And in there's some very lengthy passages inserted in there that include many stories. A lot of the kind of biographical material and a lot of the fantastic stories that we have come from the commentaries, from the Atikata. They're valuable for giving a teaching, and he might mention something like the Nagas. Then the commentary will go and give a long story about the Nagas to fill in the gap. By this time, when Buddhaghosa wrote down the commentaries, this became what we think of now as the orthodox Theravada definitions and views of things. That dates to Buddhaghosa's time. And his final work was the Suddhimagga, which is in English is the Path of Purification, and it's a very important text in the Theravada world. It's like a summary of all the teachings with the emphasis on meditation practice. It's quite a hefty book. It's like, 800, 900 pages, and not always an easy read. It can get very technical, but there's also a wealth of anecdotes and stories in the Suddhimagga. It's a text that anyone who's serious about studying Theravada Buddhism really needs to look at. It's been translated in English as the Path of Purification. They were also included in the commentaries, or the Atikata, are some texts like the Dhammapada and the Jatakas. The Jatakas are birth stories of the Buddha, previous lives of the Buddha. And the part that's considered canonical are the verse sections. They were considered to be verses spoken by the Buddha. And often they're very short and cryptic and you can't make too much sense out of them on their own. And the Adhikatha spins out the story that if you see collections of Jataka tales, that's all from the commentaries, the explanations of the verse. That may or may not have been Buddhaghosa's work. I think probably not. Dhammapada is also the same way. Dhammapada is a collection of verses that's very often one of the first Buddhist scriptures people pick up is the Dhammapada verses. And each verse has a story associated with it in the commentary. And that's been translated by a man named Burlingame as Buddhist legends. There's a wealth of stories in that. There's also the Wimanawatu and the Petawatu, which are all same structure. There's a verse, there are stories of the Dewas, and the Petawatu are stories of the ghosts, the 100 ghosts. So the commentarial literature ends up being more voluminous than the suttas because it's commentaries on the suttas. There's also commentaries on the Vinaya and there's commentaries on the Abhidhamma as well. And if these are not authored by Buddhaghosa, they're at least roughly from his lifetime or shortly thereafter. It was like the period of the commentarial period of was a third layer of texts that were added. They're called the Tika. They're the subcommentaries. They're like commentaries on the commentaries, explaining obscure points in the commentaries. So the Tikas tend to be shorter in general than the Adhikatha, but there are some lengthy passages in there too. So any text in the suttas that you find will have a commentary and a sub-commentary attached to it. Now I'll say a few words. That's the basic layers. I'll say a few words about translations and availability of translations. The Sutta Pitaka has been entirely translated into English and also by now into many other languages. I know for sure there's complete German translation. I don't know about other European languages if they're complete, but certainly Oriental languages like Thai and Sinhalese, there are translations. But the English texts, the sources for them are, first of all, the Pali Text Society has in London, England, has the old translations. And some of them are quite dated now, but they were pioneering works, very scholarly in their approach. And there are a few bits of the Sutta and Vinaya Pitaka that you can only get in translation from the PDS version. They haven't been retranslated in modern times. Some of these translations date back to the 19th century. And I think modern readers tend to find them rather stilted. I get the impression from reading some of the PTS versions that the translators were trying to mimic the tone of the King James Bible. They're trying to use kind of elevated poetic language. But modern translations, the bulk of the work is in recent times it's been done by Bhikkhu Bodhi, who's a very, very brilliant scholar, and he's translated the Anguttara and the Samyutta, and he's recently come out with a translation of Sutta Nipata and Commentary. And he's also partly responsible for the translation of the Majjhima. That was the work done on the Majjhima by his teacher, Nyanamoli, who died without completing the work, and he put the passages together and finished it up. So he's done a lot of, and his translations are very good in many ways. One of them is that his books have a wealth of footnotes, end notes actually. You could, so if you want, which will include quotations from the commentaries or comparisons with the Abhidhammas. So if you kind of getting into that scholarly approach, his translations are really good that way. The Digha Nikaya was translated by Maurice Walsh, the modern translation. His approach is a bit different. He tends to be more going for poetic fluid English, so his translations are a little looser. But you can compare it to the old PTS English of Rice Davids, who was one of the better translators of that older tradition, and his translations are very literal and close to the text. And there's a lot of sutta material available freely online, mostly translated by Tenisaru Bhikkhu, and he's a monk that lives in California, from the Ajahn Lee tradition. His translations tend to be they're good and accurate, but he likes to use non-standard kind of expressions that which are justifiable in many cases, but they often can be confusing. I think the best example is that he translates dukkha as stress, which confuses people, I think. But he explains what he means by stress. It's actually very good. It doesn't mean psychological stress, because it's like stress in the engineering sense. How one thing rubs against another, one thing bears upon another. This is dukkha. But people read it, they assume it's the psychological meaning of stress, and it's a bit wrong and narrow for the word dukkha. Which brings up a general point about translation, that any translation is going to be only an approximation. It's the nature of language, that no two languages are fully isomorphic. You can't just directly map one language into the other. I've done a little bit of translation work myself. I'm not, it's never been translated before. And it's the first time I've done any extensive amount of translation. And I really got a deep appreciation for people like Bhikkhu Bodhi who can do it so fluidly. I found that occasionally I could work my way through a whole passage of Pali and pretty well understand it, but then I had to really struggle. How do you say that in English? It doesn't map. Like you can't just say word by word to make it work. And the structure of Pali languages is quite different from English. It's a highly inflected language, like Latin. So it's a kind of different thought form to read in Pali. So if you're studying the scriptures, then you should bear that. And if you don't know or don't want to dig into the Pali, can help if you can compare different translations. Sometimes that will throw light on it. It's also useful to have a vocabulary of basic Pali terms and what they actually mean. So when you encounter something in a text like the word suffering, which is usually used to translate dukkha, you can mentally understand it's a little bit different than what we mean in English by suffering. One text that is very useful, a small book, the Buddhist Dictionary by Nyanatiloka. But here, this is a real old version. There's paperback versions out, very common, and you can get it for free online as a PDF. And it has all the kind of technical terms in Pali and their explanation. It's not a complete dictionary by far. It doesn't have common words like words for house or horse or something, but for mental states and things that directly relate to the Dhamma, it's pretty complete. A good source for Theravada literature in general. Well, so, all Bhikkhu Bodhi's translations have come out now in Wisdom Publications. That's some place to check for those. But there's an outfit in Sri Lanka called the Buddhist Publication Society, and they produce a wealth of material, and it's quite cheap. They're not free. I mean, they're not giveaway books, but they're cheap. They just just recover their costs. And one of the things that they have published is a number of translations of bits of the Atthakatha in book form, like a commentary to one particular sutta. Like here's the commentary to the Brahmajala Sutta. You see, it's fairly thick. Sure. Another book I would recommend is that they publish, Buddhist Publication Society. That's a useful, extremely useful. It's got an index of all the suttas by title and where you can find them. So if you so to bring this to a close pretty soon, just to kind of recap the structure of the literature. There, it's in three layers: the canon, the commentaries, which are called Atthakatha in Pali, and the subcommentaries of Tika. And the Sutta Pitaka, or the canon, is divided into Sutta Pitaka, Vinaya Pitaka, and Abhidhamma Pitaka. And that's the structure in the Theravada Scriptures, which are in Pali language. And it is the only collection of early Buddhist scriptures that's completely extant to the present day. There were other early schools of Buddhism that have, like the Sarvastivada, the Dhammaguptika, that have as good a claim to antiquity as the Theravada, but they didn't survive down to modern times. So I'll stop there and stay on to see if there's any questions in the chat. I'm not seeing any questions. I either explained it all really well, or I just totally baffled everyone so much that they didn't know what to say. Okay, I encountered a lot of bad translations. This started a couple of years ago. Which is like, okay, excellent and well-trained mules, thoroughbreds, and horses, with tusk elephant. Better still is the man who has subdued himself. That's from where? That sounds like Dhammapada. Okay, yeah, Dhammapada. Why do you think that's a bad translation? Oh, yeah. Well, the Buddha used a comparison of people to animals. The Buddha used a lot of metaphors, and a lot of metaphors like this one come from his background as being a kshatriya, that is a warrior noble. So he would have been in his youth used to the training of horses and elephants, and then he extrapolated or compared that to his career as the Buddha, training humans. Yeah, a tamed elephant is led to a crowd, and a king mounts a tamed elephant. Best among men is subdued one who endures abuse. Yeah, someone who's calm by nature and not. Yeah, no, I think Veronica. I think your problem is not. It's not with the translation. It's your problem is you're objecting to that teaching somehow. When he says, yeah, of course, you should avoid abusing others. But if you are the recipient of abuse, then you don't. You shouldn't succumb to anger and ill will. Now this is. I don't know. You're. I think you're missing the point. Who is the king who is mounting? I think the king, when in the metaphor of the king mounting the tamed elephant, would be, your higher spiritual nature is above your passions and your defilements. Point is that previous verse explicitly say to avoid such abusive people. Yeah, of course. I think you're just objecting to the metaphor. Anybody else have a question? How do we know what are the original words of the Buddha and what are added in sutras in later times? I did go over that a little bit at the close to the beginning of the discussion. That we can never be, 100% sure with anything going that far back in time. But there is the method of comparing, to critique the texts, from a scholarly point of view. There is the method of comparing the Pali suttas to the Agamas. And Bhikkhu Bodhi's done some of this. You'll see in his notes to the Anguttara that he points out where the Pali texts differ from the Agamas. If they agree, if the Pali text and the Agama agrees, then we can know with certainty that the text was original to at least the time of the first council, before the schools split. Or the second council, I should say, at least to the time of the second council, when the schools split. And anything that's been changed would appear in only one collection or the other. And when they do this comparison, they find that the vast bulk of the texts agree. If the translation works to move you to this passion and this enchantment, it's a good translation. Yeah, but maybe it's not an accurate translation. But yeah, that's what you're saying. Do I think the Diamond Sutra is consistent with Theravada teaching? Yeah, I actually think that I don't see anything in that particular sutra that a Theravada would really object to. And I didn't even get into my talk into the Mahayana scriptures. That's a whole another big area. What are my thoughts on the Heart Sutra? Again, I find that I don't find any problem with that. It's a statement. It's a statement of emptiness, basically. Yeah, see the translations as tools and material for your raft. Work on your raft and take what is needed at the moment. Yeah, yeah. The purpose of the suttas is to give teachings that will lead to the liberation of the mind. I don't know. I'm not sure about that verse. I mean, I'd have to try and look it up, and I would question what does the next verse after that say. I would also say about the Dhammapada translations. The Dhammapada has been translated more times than I think any text of any kind anywhere. There's so many versions of the Dhammapada out there. The Pali verse is tricky to translate, and it's very easy to put your own spin on things with translation of verse, because it can be obscure. No, we don't all need to be scholars. Oh yeah, okay. Well, that's verse 245. Well, then it makes sense. It's saying, it's just like the path of the worldly one can seem easy, and the path of the one who tries to live a higher life can seem difficult. It's like the Christian saying that the road to hell is broad and the road to heaven is narrow. You've got to see, particularly with these Dhammapada verses, you've got to understand that they're metaphorical, poetical expressions. They're not to be taken too literally. Can I recommend a good translation of Dhammapada? I'm not dead sure which one I would recommend offhand. I would say that one I would avoid is the Penguin version, Penguin edition, translated by a Christian priest, and he put a lot of sort of eternalist views in there. Oh, the one by Narada. Look for the one by Narada. That's actually quite good, because he tries to be very literal and just express what's in the original text without prettying it up. Yeah, maybe people are revising their translations. Narada, Narada. Now, ahimsa is harmlessness. So it's not harming would be better. I think not killing is too narrow for ahimsa. Ahimsa is a practice of going through the world doing no harm. The first precept is panatipata, is literally refers to not killing, but the virtue of ahimsa is not harming. Okay, I think we're slowing down here. Well, people are always refining their work. I mean, particularly with verse, like Dhammapada is poetry. So it's very difficult to translate poetry. You heard of Mara? Yeah, of course. Okay, I think we're gonna draw this to a close. Okay, I'm gonna end this in this stream. Thank you all for coming. Can I talk about stream entry sometime? Yeah, that might actually be a good topic to deal with, the 4 stages of awakening of the 10 Samyojanas. I'll keep that in mind for a topic for a coming talk. Okay, bye all.